Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
It is difficult to be unaware of the fact that the members of the black community in the United States were for a long time regarded as second-class citizens. Following the emancipation of the slaves after the Civil War, their dignity survived with difficulty through segregation policies until the Civil Rights Movement and still today. We don't have to look further than the statistics on poverty and on disproportionate imprisonments, as well as implicitly discriminatory policies. The black community has been living for centuries under some form of control by the dominant white society. So I wondered, how is this situation represented in cinema today? My thoughts quickly landed on the satirical horror thriller written and directed by Jordan Peele, Get Out. On my first viewing, the film appeared to be a comment on the contemporary African-American situation. For example, when the police officer asks for Chris' ID without any reason. Chris knows that he should obey if he doesn't want any problem. His lack of surprise unfortunately indicates a habit of servitude. It is only one example among others. The film seemed to me to be a clever take on racism, starting in a realistic way and then shifting to science fiction. But by paying closer attention to its imagery, a new angle revealed itself, particularly with this shot, this one, and that one. Why the TV? Why the screen? Well, because it is at the core of the subtext in Get Out. With the screen, Peele offers us a door to a problem both complementary and causal of an implicit racism: representation. But first, at the beginning of the 20th century, the feeling of failure towards the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, added to the social and demographic changes that it caused, contributed to the rise of debates about the nature and the biological characteristics of black people and their place in society. More than 150 years after the emancipation of the slaves, the black problem is still not solved. The main reason is the presence of racist ideologies in the US collective unconscious, coming from a tendency to classify the other. But a complete social and cultural assimilation of this other would dehistoricize their differences, reducing the African American identity to a mere shadow, risking of erasing it completely. Author and professor Christina Sharp develops the idea of the wake in reference to an awakening of conscience, to a funeral as a process of recollection, and to the waves created after the passing of a boat. To be in the wake is to occupy and to be occupied by the continuous and changing present of slavery's as yet unresolved unfolding. It is by the screen that this unresolved slavery is presented in Get Out, by these screens, and by extension, ours. To fully grasp the importance of Get Out in black cinema, let's go back a bit. The first wave of so-called at the time race films arrived in the middle of the 1910s, mostly in response to the controversial The Birth of a Nation. The marketing of these films, aiming at a mainly black audience, was often limited to a mention of the actor's race. The words all-black cast appeared on advertising material, often with no additional information. After a second wave in the 1940s, another one about 20 years later at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, then came the blaxploitation films in the 70s. Unfortunately, black cinema had practically always been in margin of the dominant Hollywood white cinema. Moreover, black films from Oscar Micheaux to Melvin Van Peebles and beyond were often muffled by the censors. On one of the posters for Sweet Sweetback's Badass song, it was specified, rated X by an all-white jury. This simple mention shows a discriminatory evaluation by the white power towards black films. In the 1980s, the new black cinema, born from a search for cultural identity, managed to take its place for a short time inside the Hollywood industry. It was a cinema that was aimed at the large audience, and was about the history or the contemporary situation of the black community. This cinema was almost completely dissolved by the majors when they absorbed the independent studios in the 1990s. After that, Hollywood films about the African American situation were rare. It was mostly the black actor's face or talent that the producers were looking for, not their identity. New stars like Denzel Washington and Will Smith rarely obtained roles specifically because they were black. Because the issues covered were seldom specific to African American, the black and white characters were interchangeable. Also, with no intention of attacking the quality of the films, it is deplorable that Hollywood is leaning in the past several years towards stories of white saviors, as well as stories about the black reality in the past tense. By addressing only subjects like the slavery or the civil rights movement, for example with films like 12 Years a Slave or Selma, it is implied that the fight for equality is no longer an issue and that this black problem is already a thing of the past. However, a film like Get Out stands out since its subject is very precisely black identity in its present context. Throughout history, we have seen the emergence of a good amount of stereotyped representation of blacks in theater, graphic art, and cinema. We've seen the birth of stereotyped characters like the Mammy, Uncle Tom, Jim Crow, Pickaninnies, or Coons. By the proliferation of such characters and others, by and for the white culture, the image of black people was reduced to an inferior and unidimensional beings. Among all these practices contributing to the idea of inferiority and servitude of the blacks, what is essential to mention for the analysis of Get Out is the blackface. It is a practice born from the minstrel shows, which consisted for white actors to darken their face with coal in order to play stereotyped black characters who only knew how to dance. Whereas blackface allowed for whites to cover their face with the black otherness, black actors such as Reuben Crowder started to do it also, which caused to dissolve and moderate this concept of otherness by recapturing the practice. It also helped them to avoid financial struggle, but at the same time contributed to extend several stereotype representation. In a scene at the beginning of Get Out, as a foreshadowing, Chris is shaving in front of the mirror. The cream covers half his face, and he cuts himself with the blade. Let's see this scene symbolically. Chris looks at his reflection, both the image he would like to show to the world and in which he should recognize himself. Here the face of a young man, white-faced, because he would like to be integrated, but this detachment of his own identity only wounds him. Then the interest that the white folks express towards Chris is limited to his physical abilities, bringing up all the stereotypes according to which blacks are all athletic.
Okay.
Oh, not bad. Hey, Nielsen. So, is it true? Is it better? Wow.
It is some kind of implicit racism. A racism which would have evolved from a rejection of individuals simply because they are black, to an interest towards these same individuals precisely because they are black.
People want to change. Some people want to be stronger, faster, cooler.
Black is in fashion.
They are persistently classified by their physical attributes. The white characters only seek to use a black body to serve their interest, just like the Blackface did. Blackface was itself, in my opinion, an extension of the ideology of slavery, in the sense that the whites took possession, here symbolically, of the black bodies for their own profit, just like the slave owners possessed the bodies of their slaves. The same happens in Get Out. The procedure of the transposition of mind is the literal version of a blackface, a white controlling the body of a black, burying his black identity. One uses the body of the other as if it were a puppet, like a cultural slavery. It goes without saying that the representation is not reality. The meaning and the ideology which rises from representation depend on the way in which the event is represented. The execution, the language, create certain meanings. Also, meaning is not created only by produced images, but by the action of looking at them. Thus, the technique and its interpretation are also significant in the propagation of ideologies. Here's what the sociologist Stuart Hall has to say on the representation of black people. We tend to privilege experience itself, as if black life is lived experience outside of representation. Instead, it is only through the way in which we represent and imagine ourselves that we come to know how we are constituted and who we are. So it is logical for black artists or screenwriters to want to integrate the system which for a long time so negatively represented them. Representing themselves is necessary, since black identity encompasses the life and social status of the community as much as its image in the, especially white, collective unconscious. A cinema of the ghetto is likely to close the community upon itself. The use of a popular and accessible cinematic language such as Hollywood classicism is crucial in retaking control of the black identity by black people. Writer-director Melvin Van Peebles claims to have to accept the rules of the dominating cinema to be able to reverse the reductive and negative image of blacks in the collective unconscious. The protest should be executed within stereotypes, by using them. To paraphrase Stuart Hall, to open the practice of representation on itself makes it possible to keep it favorable to attribution of new meaning. A film like Get Out uses an accessible language, that of Hollywood classicism, as well as tropes from horror cinema, to address the representation of racial identity and shift it to the point of view of the oppressed. The viewpoints are reversed, the other becomes the subject. Like a Trojan horse, it addresses the problem of a hidden racism and makes victorious the black young man by his action towards emancipation. But in Get Out, how is introduced the theme of representation and how is it disputed? Its techniques are relatively simple but very effective. The first hypnosis scene is the most eloquent. The first part of the scene is built from simple shot reverse shots.
You just dangle a pocket watch in front of people's faces, is that it?
You watch a lot of TV.
When I was a kid.
Now you're feeling very sleepy. We do use focal points sometimes to guide someone into a state of heightened suggestibility.
Heightened suggestibility.
That's right. That's right.
We later learned that Chris was at his mother's side at the time of her accident, but then went back home, traumatized, and settled in front of the TV, his escape from reality. Peele adopts Chris's point of view, making us hear the rain of his memories and the image of his young self in front of the television set.
You hear it? Find it. Tell me when you found it.
Chris feels he cannot move anymore. Missy confirms he is indeed paralyzed.
Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
The body of Chris is motionless on the armchair, whereas his mind is detached, falling into a dark place. Malian cultural theorist Mantia Diawara describes the process of identification as such. Identification in film is this regressive behavior of the viewer in front of the screen in the darkness of the room. It is a regression of a narcissistic type, during which, motionless and aphasic, the audience is transported through imagination in the situation of the story and the characters, while assimilating the cultural codes that they convey. Chris is in a dark place, such as a movie theater. Now trusting Missy, good narrator that she is, Chris becomes passive. He watches himself without being in control. He can only look at the images which, following the TV or cinema screen ratio, projects the events in front of his eyes. Chris becomes a spectator. Then the process of transposition of mind symbolizes a representational slavery by using a literal blackface. Someone will play the part of the black young man, thus Chris can only partially identify with the images on the screen. I see this process as criticism of representational control by the white Hollywood industry over the African American characters and culture. Peele urges black Americans to refuse cultural slavery by a white industry and to take back control over their own representation. In the context of the black community as a figure of otherness, Get Out is a product of their social situation, an argument to the definition of black cinema, a result of the history of this black cinema, an answer to stereotypes, and a decision maker in its own representation. With Get Out, Jordan Peele did what several black filmmakers undertook before him, mostly outside of Hollywood. He integrates the dominant industry and holds up a mirror to it, telling it that things must change. Winning the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay has surprised many, since it is this same industry that Peele criticizes that gave it to him. Perhaps this is a true and honest step forward by Hollywood, finally understanding maybe that an adequate representation of the black community doesn't automatically mean a financial risk. Post-Obama USA seems thirsty for this kind of cinema, especially when looking at the huge commercial success of films like Black Panther, as well as the critical recognition and the Oscar for Best Picture to Moonlight. Let us hope that a new time has come and that many future black films show as much quality, success, and appreciation. Thank you for watching, I hope you liked it. 2 series are already on the channel and more are coming. Also a special thanks to the contributors on Patreon. Subscribe to the channel and follow the Facebook page. I'm René for FILMSTRIP. Thanks and see you soon.